It was the end of October, 1997, when I got the call. I was a county deputy back then, stationed in a quiet rural stretch of northern Arkansas, a place where time seemed to crawl and news rarely traveled far. Most of my shifts were uneventful. Traffic stops, noise complaints, the occasional drunk passed out behind the wheel of his truck. But that night was different. It started with a report from an old farmer who said he'd smelled something foul near the edge of his property. Something like rotting meat, coming from the woods behind an old cabin that hadn't been lived in for years. I remember the drive out there clearly. The sky was overcast, and a thin drizzle kept smearing against my windshield. The road was narrow, winding between fields of dead cornstalks and patches of dark forest. My headlights hit nothing but mist and tree trunks. There were no other cars, no lights from houses, no sounds except the steady hum of the engine and the soft thud of rain on metal. My dog, a brown shepherd mix named Copper, sat quietly in the passenger seat. He always rode with me on late calls. He didn't bark much, but when he did, it meant something. By the time I reached the cabin, night had swallowed the countryside. The place looked like it hadn't seen a human hand in decades. The wood was darkened and warped, and parts of the roof had caved in. Tall weeds covered the path leading up to the porch, and the single window on the front side was shattered, with jagged glass still clinging to the frame. The farmer's land ended just beyond a rusted wire fence that sagged toward the ground. I parked beside it, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, listening. The air was heavy and still, but there was a faint buzzing, flies, hundreds of them, somewhere near the cabin. Copper started to growl low in his throat when I opened the door. He stared toward the dark outline of the cabin, ears raised, nose twitching. I switched on my flashlight and stepped into the weeds, my boots sinking into the wet ground. The smell hit almost immediately, sweet, thick, and unmistakably rotten. It clung to the back of my throat, made me gag for a second. I had smelled death before, but not like this. This was old decay, something that had been left to rot for days, maybe weeks. I walked slowly around the cabin, shining the beam along the ground, through the brush. Copper stayed close behind me, moving cautiously. When I reached the back corner, I saw what had drawn the flies. A few feet from the wall, half buried in the mud, was what looked like a bundle of tarp. The smell was stronger there. I could see torn bits of plastic and something pale sticking out from under it, bone, maybe. My stomach tightened as I crouched down, shining the light closer. It wasn't just bone. It was a hand, gray, swollen, and stiff. Whoever it was had been there a while. I stepped back and looked around. The area was quiet, too quiet. The woods behind the cabin stretched out like a black wall, dense with trees and brush. The air felt wrong, like the world was holding its breath. I radioed it in, gave the coordinates, and said I'd wait for backup. But the dispatcher said the other deputies were on the far side of the county and it would take time. Out here, time meant at least an hour, maybe more. I wasn't going to just stand there. I decided to check inside the cabin. The door hung half off its hinges, scraping against the floor when I pushed it open. The smell inside was almost unbearable. A mix of damp wood, mold, and something metallic, like old blood. My flashlight beam swept across the room, catching the outlines of a broken chair, a collapsed table, and a mattress that looked like it had been torn apart by animals. Cobwebs hung thick in the corners. There were dark stains on the floorboards, irregular and smeared. I moved deeper in, watching where I stepped. Copper stayed at the doorway, whining softly. There were footprints on the dusty floor, newer than the rest of the mess. Deep prints like someone had been there recently. I followed them to the back of the cabin, where there was another door, half-rotted and hanging by one hinge. Behind it, I found a small storage area. There were empty cans, old tools, and a few blankets piled in the corner. The air back there was colder, heavier somehow. Then I saw something else. On one of the beams above the doorway, there was a rusty hook with a piece of rope still tied to it. The end of the rope had frayed and snapped, but the wood around it was stained darker than the rest. I didn't need to imagine what had been hanging there. Copper barked suddenly, loud and sharp. I spun around, nearly slipping on the wet floor, and ran back to the front of the cabin. He was outside, standing near the fence line, growling toward the tree line. I moved quickly toward him, shining my light into the darkness, but all I saw were trees. The rain was picking up again, steady and cold. That's when I noticed something new. Another set of tire tracks, half washed away by mud, leading off the old dirt road behind the cabin. They were fresh, maybe a few hours old. Too fresh to belong to the farmer who called it in. I followed them a short distance until the ground got too soft, then crouched down to take a closer look. The tread was from an older truck, something with heavy tires. And next to one of the tracks was a cigarette, but still damp but not old. Someone had been here probably earlier that day. It made sense now. Someone had dumped the body behind the cabin and left in a hurry. Maybe they used the place before. Maybe they knew no one came out here much. The old hook, the stains, the footprints, it all felt like it had been used before. I'd seen plenty of bad scenes in my time, but there was something about the silence around that cabin that made it worse. It wasn't fear exactly, more like knowing that whoever did it could still be close. I backed away and stood near the truck, keeping my flashlight steady toward the trees. The rain turned into a steady downpour, and the ground was slick. Copper barked again, facing the woods, and I caught the faint crunch of something moving in the distance. Not an animal. The rhythm was too slow, too deliberate. I couldn't see anything through the rain and mist, but the sound of movement stopped as soon as I stepped forward. For the next half hour, I stood there, every muscle tight, waiting. Nothing else moved. No sounds, no lights, just the rain and the smell of death hanging over the place. When backup finally arrived, the other deputies found me standing by the fence with Copper beside me, soaked to the bone. The investigation dragged on for weeks. The body was identified as a drifter, a man who'd been missing for nearly 2 months. No ID, no known address. They said he died from blunt force trauma to the head, no gunshot, no knife, just beaten and left to rot. They found traces of blood inside the cabin, older stains, some matching the victim, some not. That meant whoever had used that place had probably done it before. But no fingerprints, no witnesses, nothing to tie it to anyone. The case went cold after that. Files got buried, attention moved elsewhere. The cabin was finally torn down a year later, but even then, I couldn't shake it. Every time I drove that stretch of road, I'd look toward the tree line and see where it used to stand. That empty patch of land that seemed to breathe with its own kind of silence. Years later, after I left the force, I still thought about that night. I could still smell the wet earth, the rot, and the faint metallic taste in the air. I could still see Copper standing at the fence, staring into the woods like he saw something I didn't. The part that stuck with me most wasn't the body or the cabin. It was the tracks, those tire tracks that led away into the dark. They ended about 50 yards down the road, as if the driver had stopped there for a while before turning back toward the highway. No one ever figured out why, but I knew what that meant. Whoever had dumped that body had stayed long enough to watch. Maybe from the trees, maybe from the road. Every time I think back on it, I realize how close I probably was, how close Copper and I were to the person who did it. Maybe just a few hundred feet away in the dark, standing still, watching as I stood there shining my light into the trees. That's what keeps me up now. Not the memory of what I saw, but the thought of what I didn't. It was late autumn of 2017 when I decided to take a short trip to a remote part of northern England. I had been working in London for years, barely taking any time off, and I needed a few quiet days away from noise, traffic, and people. I found a small wooden cabin for rent near a forested area just outside a village called Ravensmoor in Cheshire. The pictures online showed an old but solid structure, sitting at the edge of thick woods, surrounded by tall, damp grass. It looked peaceful, simple, and quiet, exactly what I wanted. The road to the cabin was narrow, winding between old stone walls and patches of fog that seemed to cling low over the ground. I arrived just before sunset. The air smelled of wet soil and rotting leaves. The cabin itself looked older than it did in the pictures. The paint was peeling, the wooden steps were slightly slanted, and moss had crept up the corners. Still, it was sturdy enough. Inside, there was one small bedroom, a living area with a fireplace, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The windows were small and framed with dark wood, and the whole place smelled faintly of smoke and old pine. That first night, I didn't think much of anything. I unpacked my bag, lit a fire, made some tea, and sat down to read. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the cabin walls with a slow, dragging sound. I remember feeling calm, a kind of silence I hadn't felt in years. I went to bed early, tired from the drive. It must have been around midnight when I woke up. The room was cold, and the fire in the other room had gone out. There was no sound at first, just the soft creak of the old wood. But after a moment, I heard something else. Faint footsteps outside. They were slow, deliberate, like someone walking in wet grass near the front porch. I froze for a second, just listening. The steps came closer, stopped, then started again, circling slowly around the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or someone from the village checking the place. But something about the rhythm of those steps didn't sound like an animal. It was too steady, too human. I sat there in the dark, staring at the thin curtains, waiting for them to stop. They eventually did. After that, I couldn't sleep again. The next morning, everything looked normal. The grass outside was wet with dew, but I noticed footprints, light impressions leading from the path to the side of the cabin and then disappearing into the trees. I told myself it could have been the caretaker, maybe checking on something, but still, something about it unsettled me. I spent the day hiking in the woods behind the cabin. The air was cold but clear, and the forest was quiet except for the occasional crow. I walked for a few hours, following a narrow trail until I reached an old fence, half collapsed and covered in ivy. There were remnants of an old stone structure beyond it, maybe a farmhouse that had been abandoned decades ago. Everything about that area felt heavy, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I didn't stay long. That evening, I noticed something strange. As the light faded, I saw movement at the edge of the woods through the window. A figure, faint at first, standing still, half hidden behind the trees. It looked like a woman, wearing something pale, almost gray, her hair long and unkempt. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I looked again, she was gone. I went outside, half angry at myself for even feeling uneasy. The woods were silent. There was no one there. Later that night, I couldn't shake the image. I sat in the chair near the window, the firelight flickering behind me, and I kept glancing toward the tree line. Around midnight again, I heard something, faint scratching near the back door, slow, irregular, like nails against the wood. My heart was pounding. I stood still, listening. After a few seconds, it stopped. I waited for a long time before going back to the bedroom. When I finally slept, it was uneasy. I woke up before dawn to the sound of something dripping. I got up and found water leaking through a small gap near the window. It must have rained overnight. As I looked out, I saw something on the porch. A small patch of mud smeared near the door handle, and what looked like the shape of a handprint, faint but clear enough to see the outline of fingers. The next day, I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. I told myself the cabin was old, the sounds were normal, and that maybe I'd imagined the woman entirely. I tried to distract myself, drove to the nearby village, bought groceries, and spoke to a man at the store about the weather. He said nothing unusual happened out there except the occasional hiker getting lost in the woods. I didn't mention what I'd seen. That night, I stayed up later than usual. I left a light on and kept the curtains drawn. Around 1 a.m., I started hearing something again. A faint rustling sound coming from the side of the cabin, followed by a soft thump. It was like someone brushing against the walls, moving slowly along the outside. My throat felt dry. I didn't move, just listened. The sound went from one side of the cabin to the next, then stopped completely. I waited a long time, maybe an hour, before finally getting up the nerve to look outside. When I pulled the curtain just a little, I saw her. A woman standing near the edge of the porch, facing the cabin. Her hair was messy, sticking to her face, and her clothes looked dirty, like they hadn't been washed in weeks. She wasn't moving, just standing there, head slightly tilted. The porch light hit her face for a moment, and I saw her eyes. They were wide open, blank, but not in a supernatural way, just a vacant, empty, like she wasn't really seeing anything. I stepped back from the window, my hands shaking. I didn't go outside. I didn't move at all. I waited, listening. After a few minutes, I heard her walk away. Her steps faded into the woods again. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed my things. But before I left, I noticed something else. A small piece of torn fabric caught on a nail near the porch railing. It was part of a dress, grayish-white, damp, and dirty. I didn't touch it. I just stood there, staring at it for a while before getting in the car and driving off. When I returned to the village to drop the cabin keys at the small rental office, I asked the old woman there if anyone else lived near the woods. She told me there wasn't anyone for at least 2 miles in either direction. She said the last house in that area burned down over 30 years ago. Some people still cut through the woods sometimes, but not many stayed long. I didn't ask any more questions. I drove back to London that same day. The entire way, I kept thinking about her. That face, those still eyes, the way she stood without moving. There was nothing ghostly about her. She was real, alive, breathing, standing there in the cold. But the way she moved, the silence of it, the complete absence of any reason for her being there, that was what made it worse. For weeks afterward, I kept replaying it all in my head. The sounds, the handprint, the piece of fabric. I even looked up old records of missing people in that area, but nothing matched. Eventually, I tried to forget it. I went back to work, back to the noise of the city. But every so often, especially on cold nights when the wind pressed against my windows, I thought about that cabin again. Sitting there on the edge of the woods, alone, quiet, waiting. And somewhere in those woods, maybe even now, someone's still walking. Slow steps in wet grass, circling what's left of that old cabin, watching through those small windows, the same way she watched me. It was late autumn of 2017 when I took the ranger position at a small, underfunded park in northern Montana called Dry Ridge Reserve. The park was barely known. Thick pine forests, narrow trails, and a single gravel road that twisted up through the hills to an old ranger cabin built sometime in the 1960s. It wasn't a glamorous job, but I needed space and quiet after leaving the city. The ranger post was isolated, sitting several miles away from the nearest small town. I was told it used to be a hunting lodge before the Park Service took it over. The cabin had 2 rooms, a main area with a wood stove, a desk, a metal cot, and a small kitchen space that still smelled faintly of smoke from years of fires. The back room was storage, mostly filled with old park signs, broken tools, and some rusty fuel cans. The first few weeks there were uneventful. My routine was simple. Check the trails, refill map boxes, make sure campers followed fire regulations, and keep track of wildlife movement. I didn't see many visitors since the season was ending. Most days, the only sound was wind moving through the trees or the groaning of old wood when the temperature dropped at night. By early November, the weather turned colder, and the park emptied completely. My supervisor told me I'd be staying up there alone for 3 weeks until they rotated another ranger in. I didn't mind at first. Isolation was what I'd come for. The first few nights were peaceful. I'd sit on the porch after dinner with a flashlight and notebook, listening to the forest settle. But the longer I stayed, the more the silence began to weigh on me. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The first odd thing happened one morning when I went to check the fire lookout trail. I noticed boot prints leading off the path into the trees. They weren't mine, and they looked fresh, pressed deep into the damp dirt, spaced unevenly like whoever made them had been moving in a hurry. They led downhill toward the creek, but when I followed them, they disappeared at the rocky bank. I scanned the opposite side but saw no sign of anyone crossing. It bothered me, but I wrote it off as a stray hunter or hiker who wandered off trail. That night, I kept thinking about those prints. The weather dropped below freezing, and I could hear small cracks and thuds outside as branches stiffened and broke under frost. Around midnight, I woke up to what I thought was a knock on the cabin wall. Just one dull thump, like someone had hit it with a fist. I lay there listening for a while, holding my breath, but it never came again. I went back to sleep, convincing myself it was the wood contracting in the cold. The next morning, I found something strange near the woodpile behind the cabin. One of the logs I'd split was lying a few feet away, half buried in frost, with an old torn glove beside it. It wasn't mine. It was worn, brown leather, soaked stiff from the cold. I picked it up and saw a dark stain near the thumb. It looked like dried blood, but I didn't want to believe that. I set it on the porch railing, figuring maybe some hunter dropped it passing through, though that didn't explain the log being moved. Over the next several days, more things started to feel off. I'd find small signs that someone, or something, was near the cabin. Once, I woke to the faint crunch of footsteps circling outside, slow and deliberate. I stayed completely still, gripping the flashlight, listening to every step until they faded back toward the trees. In the morning, I checked for prints, but the ground was frozen hard. Nothing. Another time, I noticed one of my trail markers, a small wooden stake with reflective tape, had been pulled from the ground and stuck upside down near the edge of the woods. I replaced it, but the next day it was gone again. My sleep became restless after that. Every creak or gust of wind made me jolt awake. I began double-checking the locks and keeping my flashlight and knife beside the cot. I even nailed an extra board over the window on the back wall because I kept feeling like someone was standing out there watching. About 2 weeks into my stay, the temperature dropped drastically. A snowstorm moved through, leaving everything silent and white. I was supposed to radio in daily, but that morning the radio wouldn't pick up a signal. I climbed up the small ridge behind the cabin where reception was better. As I reached the top, I spotted something strange through the trees. Far down the slope, near the old service road, was a faint column of smoke. I stared at it for a long time. No one was supposed to be out there. That area hadn't been used in years since the park closed off the lower campsites. I decided to check it out before dark. I packed light, just my map, flashlight, and a thermos of coffee, and followed the overgrown road down. The snow muffled every sound, and the forest felt unnaturally still. After about a mile, I saw the remains of a small fire pit beside a fallen log. The smoke had nearly died, just thin wisps curling upward. Around it were scattered cans, old food wrappers, and a rolled-up sleeping bag half buried in snow. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. I crouched down and noticed drag marks in the snow, leading away toward the trees. They looked like someone had tried to pull something heavy, or maybe someone else. I followed them for a few yards until they faded into a cluster of dense pines. I stopped there. The air was colder than before, and for the first time, I felt genuinely unsafe. I turned back. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about those drag marks and the old glove. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been out there might still be around. I blocked the door with a chair and kept the stove burning low for light. Sometime after 2 a.m., I heard something that made my stomach turn. The soft creak of the porch boards. Slow, deliberate weight pressing down. Then a pause. Then another step. I could hear it through the floor. I sat up, heart pounding, staring at the door. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. After a minute, the sound moved toward the side window, then stopped. I could feel it. Someone was standing just outside, inches away from the wall. I waited for what felt like forever. And then, suddenly, a faint scraping sound started, like a nail or knife dragging across the wooden siding. Long, slow lines being carved. Stopped, then nothing. Absolute silence again. I didn't move until the first hint of daylight came through the window cracks. When I finally stepped outside, there were fresh footprints circling the cabin, leading to the side wall where I'd heard the scraping. The wood had deep gouges in it, 3 long, uneven lines carved right through the outer layer. The prints led away into the trees, disappearing after 30 or 40 feet where the snow had been disturbed by wind. I radioed my supervisor again that morning, but still no signal. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed what I could carry, maps, notebook, some food, and locked up the cabin. I started walking down the main access road toward town, 20 miles away. The hike was long and silent, but I didn't stop once. Around late afternoon, I finally got a weak radio connection near the park's boundary and reported everything. The prints, the glove, the smoke, the scraping. They told me to stay put until a patrol came for me. When the officers arrived hours later, we went back up together. They searched the cabin and surrounding woods but found nothing. No tracks, no campfire remains, no glove on the railing. Even the gouges on the wall seemed faded, like someone had tried to sand or scrape them down. The cabin looked almost untouched, except for the chair I'd left against the door. They said it was probably trespassers or hunters, maybe someone living off-grid nearby. But I knew what I heard, what I saw. The way those prints circled the cabin wasn't random. Whoever had been out there wasn't just passing through. They'd been watching for days. I quit that job a week later, packed everything and left Montana altogether. Sometimes I still think about Dry Ridge, about that small cabin sitting alone in the woods with snow covering its roof, waiting for the next ranger to move in. I can picture the porch boards creaking under unseen weight, the cold pressing against the windows, and somewhere just beyond the tree-line, someone still standing there, quiet, waiting for the light to go out again. It was early November of 2013 when I drove out to a small patch of forest land in northern Minnesota that my uncle used to own. The place had been empty for years after he passed away, but I'd always remembered the little hunting cabin he built there back in the 1980s. It was simple, 1 room, no electricity, no plumbing, just an old wood stove and a cot by the wall. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, but I decided that weekend I'd go up and spend 2 nights there alone, just to clear my head and do a bit of hunting. I left home around noon. The drive took nearly 6 hours from Duluth. Most of it was on empty back roads lined with dead trees and fields that had turned brown for the season. The closer I got, the rougher the road became. The last mile was barely even a road anymore, just 2 muddy tire tracks through the woods. My truck slid a few times before I finally saw the cabin sitting in a clearing, half hidden behind overgrown brush. The wooden siding was weathered gray, and the metal roof had rust streaks running down both sides. It looked exactly like something that had been left behind to rot. When I stepped out of the truck, the air felt heavy and cold. It wasn't snowing yet, but the sky was solid gray, like a lid pressed down on the woods. I could smell wet leaves and the faint rot of old timber. The place was quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in a way that made me aware of every sound I made. My boots crunched on the damp ground, and I could hear my own breathing more than anything else. The front door of the cabin was swollen shut, but I managed to push it open. The smell inside hit me right away. Stale air mixed with mouse droppings and old smoke. Dust floated in thin beams of light coming through the window cracks. The stove was still there, along with a few rusted pots, a broken chair, and an old hunting calendar on the wall from 1997. The cot in the corner was covered with a rotten sleeping bag. I brushed it off, set my duffel down, and started a fire in the stove using some old logs I found stacked outside. Once the fire got going, the place felt a little less dead. I hung my jacket near the stove, set up my sleeping bag, and walked around outside for a bit to get a sense of the area again. The woods behind the cabin were thick, mostly pine and birch, with the ground covered in layers of wet needles. There were old animal trails running between the trees, and I saw some fresh deer tracks heading toward a small stream a few hundred yards away. It seemed like a good spot to hunt in the morning. When night fell, I sat by the fire and cooked a can of beans over the stove. The sound of the wind outside got stronger, brushing against the cabin walls and roof. It wasn't a bad sound, but every now and then, it would stop completely for a few seconds. Dead silent, and that silence made my skin crawl. I tried reading an old paperback I'd brought, but after an hour I couldn't focus. I kept listening to little sounds, creaks, faint rustling outside, something light tapping against the wall. I figured it was just branches or animals. Still, I slept with my rifle close to the cot just in case. That first night, I woke up sometime around 2 a.m. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and I could see my breath in the cold air. What woke me wasn't a sound, but the feeling that something was off. I lay there for a while, staring at the dark ceiling, listening. Then I heard it, a dull, slow scrape along the outside wall. It wasn't fast or heavy, just a steady dragging sound that moved from one corner of the cabin to the other. I held still, thinking maybe it was an animal rubbing against the boards. Then it stopped. After maybe a minute, I heard the crunch of footsteps moving around the side of the cabin, slow, deliberate. My heart started pounding hard enough I could hear it in my ears. I reached for the rifle, loaded, and waited. The steps came closer to the front door and then paused. Nothing, just silence again. I stayed like that for nearly half an hour, sitting up, staring at the door, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Finally, I got up, opened the stove, and threw in another log just to make some noise. When I looked through the small front window, I couldn't see anything, just pitch black trees. The next morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. There were footprints, not boots, not shoes, but bare footprints, pressed into the wet ground. They circled the cabin once and then disappeared into the trees. I froze when I saw that. They were small, maybe the size of a child's foot, but the edges were too deep for a kid's weight. The thought of someone walking barefoot in that cold didn't make sense. My stomach twisted as I followed them for a bit, but they faded fast into the leaves. I tried to shake it off and went hunting that morning near the stream. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. I didn't see a single deer, not even birds. Around noon, I gave up and headed back to the cabin. The wind had picked up again, and dark clouds were gathering overhead. I could smell rain in the air. When I got back, I noticed the cabin door was slightly open. I knew I'd shut it before leaving. Inside, nothing looked stolen, but my pack had been moved. The zipper was open, and a few things, my flashlight, my lighter, a knife, were laid out neatly on the table. It looked deliberate, like someone had inspected each thing. My sleeping bag had been shifted too, like something had pressed down on it. I checked every corner, even the crawl space under the floorboards, but nothing. No footprints inside, just a faint muddy smear near the door frame. The rain started that afternoon, turning into a downpour by evening. I decided I'd leave the next morning, no matter what. The wind howled against the cabin all night. The fire barely stayed lit. Around midnight, I woke again to the same scraping sound outside. This time it was louder, closer, like something was dragging metal against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the window, but the glass was fogged up. I wiped it clear and saw something that made my stomach tighten. A figure standing near the treeline, maybe 30 feet away. It wasn't moving. The rain was coming down hard, and it was hard to make out, but I could tell it was someone tall, maybe 6 feet, just standing there. No light, no sound, just watching. I shut off the light, sat still, and waited. Every second felt stretched out. The rain drowned most sounds, but I thought I could still hear breathing outside the wall. I stayed awake until dawn, never once hearing footsteps leave. When daylight came, I looked outside again. The figure was gone, but the ground was torn up near the trees. There were deep prints, not barefoot this time, but boots, heavy ones. They led toward the forest and then vanished into the mud. I didn't waste time that morning. I packed everything, loaded the rifle, and threw my gear into the truck. The whole time I kept glancing at the woods, half expecting someone to appear between the trees. When I finally got the truck started and drove down that dirt track, I didn't look back once. My hands were shaking the whole drive out. By the time I reached the main road, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I stopped at a gas station in a small town about an hour south. My clothes were damp, my eyes burning from lack of sleep. The guy at the counter asked if I'd been up in the North Woods. I nodded, and he said something about how those lands had been empty for years after a few squatters caused trouble up there. He mentioned a man who'd gone missing in that same area around 2008. Said the sheriff stopped searching after snow buried the trails. I didn't say anything. I just paid for my gas, got back in the truck, and drove home. I never went back after that. For weeks, I kept thinking about those footprints, the bare ones circling the cabin, and the heavy boot prints after. I tried telling myself it was all explainable. Maybe someone was living out there, maybe more than one person. But what stuck with me most wasn't what I saw. It was that feeling of being watched. That long stretch of silence where I could hear my own pulse, knowing someone was standing outside those walls, just waiting. Even now, when the wind hits the side of my house at night, it sounds just like that scraping on the wood. I can still picture that dark figure near the treeline, standing perfectly still in the rain. And every time I think about it, I'm just thankful I left when I did, because whatever was out there, it wasn't lost. It knew exactly where I was. It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to spend a few weeks at my uncle's old farm cabin in northern Iowa. I was 29, working a warehouse job back in Des Moines, and I just needed a break. My uncle had passed away earlier that year, and the place had been sitting empty since. It was one of those quiet, forgotten spots where the land feels like it's frozen in time. Long dirt roads, endless fields of corn, and barns that looked like they'd collapse if you leaned too hard against them. The cabin itself sat at the edge of a long gravel road that dead-ended into a patch of overgrown woods. It wasn't much, just a single-story wooden place with peeling white paint and a porch that tilted slightly to one side. There was a small barn about 50 yards away, a rusted windmill behind it, and a few old tools scattered in the tall grass. I got there in the late afternoon, parked my old truck by the porch, and walked around a bit before going inside. The smell of dry wood and dust hit me immediately. It had that stale air that builds up when a place has been closed too long. I spent the first day cleaning, sweeping out cobwebs, and airing out the rooms. There were only one small bedroom and a larger living area that connected to a tiny kitchen. The furniture was old but solid. The floor creaked under every step. I set up my sleeping bag on the bed since the mattress smelled moldy, and by the time the sun went down, the whole place still felt half alive, like it hadn't decided whether to welcome me or not. That first night was quiet, the kind of quiet where every sound stands out. The hum of the fridge, the ticking of the clock, the soft rustle of wind through the grass outside. I left the windows open, and I could hear insects droning and, far off, the occasional cry of some animal in the woods. I remember lying awake for hours, listening, feeling that strange alertness that comes when you're in a place that's unfamiliar, especially alone. By the third night, the silence didn't bother me as much. I'd gotten used to the rhythm of the farm, the mornings starting with dew on the porch steps, afternoons filled with the sound of wind pushing through the corn, and nights that sank into blackness so deep you couldn't tell where the horizon ended. But then, late one evening, I noticed something odd. It was around 10. I just finished eating and was sitting by the small window, scrolling through my phone when I heard what sounded like metal scraping against wood outside. At first, I thought it was the wind moving something, maybe a loose piece of siding or a tool. But the sound came again, slower this time, like someone dragging something across the porch. I turned off my phone's light and just listened. The air felt heavier. Then came another sound, a soft, steady tapping, like a stick knocking against the porch railing. It lasted maybe 20 seconds, then stopped completely. I sat there staring into the dark, heart pounding, but I didn't move. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. The next morning, though, I went out to check, and the porch had faint marks along the railing. Thin scratches, fresh enough to stand out against the old paint. That put me on edge. I started locking the door every night, even though no one lived anywhere near the property. The closest neighbor was about 2 miles away. The next few nights were normal again until that Friday. It was humid that night, no breeze at all, the kind of air that feels thick enough to taste. I couldn't sleep, so I got up and sat in the living room, staring out the window. The moon was high, pale and clear, lighting the fields faintly. I could see the barn in the distance, its door slightly ajar. Then, from somewhere out near it, I caught sight of something moving, something that wasn't wind or an animal. It looked like a person, just a shadow at first, walking slowly near the barn door, stopping, then stepping back into the darkness. I froze. There was no reason anyone should have been out there. The property had been locked up for months, and I hadn't told anyone I was staying. I stayed still for almost 10 minutes, watching. I could barely breathe. The figure never came closer, never ran, just stood near the barn as if watching the cabin. I finally reached for the flashlight beside the window and flicked it on, pointing it out toward the field. The light swept across the grass, across the barn, and there was nothing. No movement, no one there, just silence again. That night, I barely slept. I kept the flashlight in my hand, waiting for sounds, but the rest of the night stayed dead quiet. In the morning, I went to check the barn. The dirt by the door had prints in it, shoes, not animal tracks. Faint, but definitely human. They circled around the building and led off toward the edge of the woods. I followed them for maybe 30 yards until they vanished into the tall grass. That's when I realized something that made my stomach drop. The prints weren't old. The soil was still soft from the night's humidity. Whoever it was had been there not long before I woke up. That day, I tried to convince myself it was nothing serious. Maybe a trespasser, maybe some kid messing around. But deep down, I knew it didn't make sense. Nobody came out this far. And what kind of person just stood in a field at night watching a cabin from a distance? By the next night, I was too nervous to stay still. I moved the table against the door and closed all the windows. I sat by the front window with the lights off, listening again. The night dragged on for hours. Around 1 in the morning, I started to hear something faint. A crunching sound, slow and deliberate, like footsteps on gravel. I leaned closer to the window, my hands sweating. The steps came from the direction of the barn again, moving toward the cabin. Then they stopped. Everything went silent. Not even the insects made a sound now. I could feel the weight of the quiet pressing down on me. I stared out, my eyes straining in the dim moonlight, and then I saw it. A shape standing just at the edge of the porch. Person, not moving, just standing there, maybe 5 feet away from the window. They weren't facing me directly, more like turned halfway, as if listening for something. I could make out the outline of their clothes, dark and loose, and the faint reflection of their hair catching the moonlight. My heart was slamming against my ribs. I wanted to move, to grab something, but I was frozen. Then, after what felt like forever, they took a single step closer. The porch boards creaked softly. I pulled back from the window and stayed quiet. After a long moment, the boards creaked again, then nothing. I waited. The night stayed still. 10 minutes passed, then 20. When I finally looked again, the porch was empty. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat with my back against the wall, flashlight in hand, until dawn came through the windows. When the sun rose, I went outside, shaking, and looked around. The ground beneath the porch had footprints again, this time clear as day. Deep prints leading up to the steps and back out toward the fields. That morning, I packed my things. I didn't bother cleaning up or checking the barn again. As I loaded my bag into the truck, I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see someone there. Nothing moved. The fields were quiet again, the air still heavy. I left before noon, dust trailing behind me as I drove down the gravel road. When I reached the main highway, I finally looked back in the mirror. The cabin was just a small shape in the distance, surrounded by fields and silence. I remember feeling a strange kind of relief, like I was escaping something that wasn't meant to be seen. A week later, I got a call from the local sheriff's office. They'd gone out to check the property after I reported the trespasser. The deputy said they found signs someone had been living out there. An old sleeping bag behind the barn, a few cans, and footprints leading deep into the woods. Whoever it was had probably been there for weeks, maybe months, moving around at night, watching the cabin. After that, I never went back. The farm's still there, probably falling apart by now. But sometimes I still think about that night. The way that person stood there, silent and still, close enough to hear me breathe through the window. And I wonder how many nights before that they might have been standing out there already, watching while I was inside, thinking I was alone. It was late October of 2013 when I decided to stay in that cabin near the old graveyard on the edge of Densmore, a small forgotten town in northern Michigan. I had taken a week off work, needing quiet away from people and noise. The cabin was owned by an older man who lived out of town. He'd listed it online as a simple off-grid retreat. The photos showed a small wooden place surrounded by pine trees, and I didn't think much about the graveyard behind it until I arrived. The drive there took almost 8 hours from where I lived. I reached around 4 in the afternoon. The sky was cloudy, the air heavy with that damp smell that always comes before rain. The road leading to the cabin turned to gravel about a mile out, and tall trees closed in from both sides. The forest seemed endless. My car bounced over potholes, and I saw the graveyard before I even saw the cabin. It was behind a line of rusted wire fencing, old headstones, some tilted, some broken, scattered unevenly through tall grass. The fence barely stood, It looked like no one had maintained the place in decades. The cabin sat maybe 50 yards beyond that. It was small, maybe 20 by 30 feet, built from darkened logs. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch leaned just enough to make me step carefully. There was a single door, a small window near it, and another on the back wall facing the woods. The air smelled like wet pine and soil. Everything felt quiet, too quiet, like the world stopped just beyond the tree line. Inside, it was bare and simple. A small cot, a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove in the corner, and a lantern hanging from a nail on the wall. The floor creaked with every step. I dropped my bag and looked around. There were cobwebs on the rafters and dust covering almost everything. The owner had said there was no electricity, just a generator if needed, but I didn't want to bother with it. I was fine with my flashlight and a small camping lamp I brought. The first evening passed quietly. I unpacked, gathered some firewood from a pile behind the cabin, and made a small fire in the stove. I ate canned food straight from the tin and sat by the window for a long time, just watching the forest fade into darkness. The graveyard was barely visible now, only the faint shapes of stones and crosses under the dying light. The sound of wind through the trees and an occasional rustle in the grass was all I heard. That night, I barely slept. The bed was uncomfortable, but that wasn't what kept me awake. Around midnight, I heard something faint outside. A steady sound, like soft scraping, came and went. I told myself it was branches against the wall or an animal. Still, it bothered me. Around 2, it stopped. I finally drifted off just before dawn. The next morning, I went outside to look around. It had rained lightly during the night. The ground was damp, and the air felt cold. Near the fence of the graveyard, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the mud. They weren't animal tracks. They looked like old work boots, large ones, and they led from behind the fence straight toward the cabin. The steps stopped just a few feet from the porch, right in front of the door. I looked at them for a long time. The mud had small ridges from the tread pattern, still sharp, which meant they were fresh. I looked around the forest, scanning between trees, but saw nothing. Just wet leaves, fog, and silence. I told myself maybe someone from town came through, maybe to visit a grave or wander. I didn't know. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I read for a while, cooked some rice on the stove, and tried to relax. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. Every sound outside, the crack of a twig, the brush of leaves, felt too close. The forest seemed alive in a strange way, like something moved when I wasn't looking. By afternoon, the sky had turned gray again. I went out to gather more firewood before dark. As I moved behind the cabin, near the line of trees, I saw something faint on one of the trunks, a mark carved roughly into the bark. It was deep, shaped almost like an X with a line through it. I looked around and realized there were more, maybe 4 or 5 trees marked the same way, forming a rough circle around the back of the cabin. I didn't know what to make of it. It didn't look new, but it didn't look old either. That night, the noises returned. Around 11, I heard footsteps outside, slow, steady, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. The floor creaked under me as I stood, trying not to make noise. I turned off the lamp. The air was heavy, and my heart pounded so loud it felt like it echoed in my chest. The steps paused near the front door. I waited, holding my breath. Then a faint scraping started again, like something dragging lightly across the wood. I stood there frozen for nearly an hour, not daring to move. Eventually, the sound faded away. In the morning, I found more footprints, even clearer this time. The same boot prints, circling the cabin, overlapping in the wet dirt. The mud was smeared near the door like someone had pressed their weight there for a while. I decided to leave that day, but my car battery was dead. I had left the trunk slightly open the night before while getting supplies, and maybe the light had drained it. There was no signal here, and the nearest road was too far to walk before nightfall. I felt trapped. I tried the generator but couldn't get it to start. It was old, rusted, and the fuel smelled sour. I spent most of the afternoon checking the woods again, hoping maybe someone lived nearby, but there were no other cabins, no signs of people at all. Just endless trees, silence, and that graveyard sitting still in the distance. That night was worse than all before. I stayed awake, sitting near the stove with my flashlight and a small hatchet I found in the corner. Around 1 in the morning, the noises began again, the same slow steps circling the cabin. Then a sound came from the back wall, a solid thud, like something striking the wood. Once, then again. I stood still, staring at the back window, but it was pitch black outside. My flashlight beam reflected on the glass, and I couldn't see beyond it. I waited, heart pounding, gripping the hatchet tight. After a few minutes, I heard breathing, faint, almost human, coming from just outside that back wall. Long, steady breaths, not fast or panicked, just calm, like whoever it was knew I was listening. My throat felt dry. I stood there, afraid to even blink. Then it stopped, just stopped. I didn't move for hours. When morning finally came, I went outside again. The ground behind the cabin was a mess of footprints. Mud was pressed deep, grass flattened. One of the back window frames had deep scratches along it, like someone had tried to pry it open. That was enough. I packed everything, grabbed my bag, and started walking the gravel road toward the main highway. It took nearly 3 hours before I finally saw a car. The driver stopped and gave me a ride back into town. Later that day, I had the cabin owner's number from the listing, so I called him when I got service. I told him what I found, what happened. He went quiet for a moment before saying he'd had trouble before with people hanging around there, using the woods to camp, maybe squatters from nearby towns. He said there were reports years ago of someone living out in those trees, an old man who used to dig in the graveyard, taking things from the graves and keeping them in the woods. They said he disappeared sometime in the late 90s, but no one ever found him. I didn't go back to get my car until 2 days later. I brought someone with me, a mechanic from town. When we arrived, everything looked the same except for one thing. Near the porch, stuck in the soft dirt, was an old rusted shovel. Its handle splintered, its metal blade buried halfway in the ground. It hadn't been there before. That was the last time I saw that place. The mechanic got the car started, and we drove off without looking back. I never told anyone else what happened, and I never learned who or what had been out there those nights. But sometimes, when I think about that breathing sound, how calm and steady it was, I wonder if it ever stopped coming to that cabin, even after I left. It had been raining for hours before I even got close to where I planned to build the cabin. The kind of rain that doesn't fall in sheets but drags itself down, slow and steady, soaking through your jacket until it feels like your skin is wet underneath. The road had turned into a narrow stretch of mud, and the sound of my truck tires struggling against it was constant. The windshield wipers kept up a slow, tired rhythm, barely pushing the heavy drops aside. The trees leaned in from both sides of the road, black outlines against a darker sky. I remember thinking I should have waited for better weather, but I'd already delayed the trip twice. I didn't want to waste another weekend doing nothing in the city. I was 34 then, living alone in a small apartment in Spokane, Washington. I'd bought the land up in the hills near Priest Lake, a thick patch of pine and cedar that barely saw sunlight in winter. My plan was simple: build a small off-grid cabin, something just big enough for me and my dog, Bailey, to escape to on weekends. It wasn't supposed to be an adventure. It was supposed to be quiet work. When I parked the truck at the edge of the clearing, the headlights cut through the rain just enough for me to see the pile of lumber I'd left there 2 weeks before. The plastic tarp covering it had half blown off, and the boards glistened with a thin layer of water. Bailey jumped out of the passenger seat before I even killed the engine, her paws splashing into the mud. She ran in a small circle, excited in that way dogs always are, unaware of how miserable everything actually was. I turned off the truck, and instantly, the sound of the rain seemed louder, hitting the hood, the roof, the ground. No thunder, no wind, just the endless tapping. I grabbed my tool bag and headed toward the pile of wood, my boots sinking a little with each step. The smell of wet earth was thick. I could taste it. The first few hours passed quietly. I worked by the light of a lantern I'd hung from a nail on one of the posts I'd put in last trip. The frame of the cabin had just started taking shape. For walls marked out, a small space for a single window, and a raised platform I was proud of. I tried not to think about the rain or how dark the forest looked around me. Every so often, I'd look at Bailey lying under the tailgate of the truck, her fur damp but her eyes half closed, calm and watchful. It was sometime around 9 when I noticed the sound. It wasn't thunder or an animal. It was faint but distinct, like something dragging through wet leaves. It came from the tree line behind the half-built cabin. I froze, hammer still in hand, trying to listen past the rain. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then it came again, a slow, dragging noise, followed by a muffled thud. I turned off the lantern, letting my eyes adjust. The forest became a black wall. The only light came from the dim reflection of the truck's headlights bouncing off the raindrops. Bailey stood up now, ears pricked, tail stiff. She wasn't barking, just staring into the darkness. I waited a long minute before deciding it was probably just a fallen branch or maybe a deer slipping in the mud. I told myself that and forced my hands back to work, though I could feel my pulse thudding in my neck. But after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching from the trees. As the night went on, the rain got heavier, hammering on the roof of the truck like small stones. The temperature dropped fast, and my breath fogged the air. I'd built enough of the frame to start putting up the first part of the roof, but my hands were shaking from the cold. I decided to stop and get some rest. I planned to sleep in the truck until morning. I threw the tools in the back, called Bailey over, and climbed into the driver's seat. She curled up on the passenger side, her wet fur filling the small space with that damp dog smell. I shut my eyes and tried to listen to the sound of the rain instead of everything else. But then I heard it again, this time closer. The dragging sound wasn't faint anymore. It was right outside the truck. I didn't move at first. I just listened. It sounded like something heavy being pulled through mud, then stopping, then scraping again. Bailey's head shot up, and a low growl came from her throat. I leaned forward slowly and looked through the fogged windshield. The beam from my headlights caught something in the distance, something pale. I couldn't tell what it was. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer carcass washed downhill by the rain. But then it moved. It shifted, slow and stiff, and I realized it was a man. He was about 30 feet away, half crouched, soaked through, his clothes clinging to him. I couldn't see his face clearly, just the way his body moved, slow, heavy, like he was hurt or drunk. He was dragging one of his legs, which made that horrible wet sound each time he took a step. I didn't move. My hand went to the handle of the door, but I didn't open it. I just watched as he limped toward the edge of the clearing. Then he stopped. He didn't look directly at me, but his head turned slightly in my direction. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. The rain fell harder, hitting the roof so loud it felt like static in my ears. Then he turned away and disappeared into the trees. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring into the darkness where he'd gone. I didn't even breathe normally until Bailey relaxed again, her head dropping back onto her paws. I told myself maybe he was a hiker who got lost, maybe drunk, maybe looking for shelter. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with how he moved, how deliberate it looked, not panicked or lost, just slow. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every few minutes, I checked the clearing with my flashlight, half expecting to see him standing there again. But there was nothing, just rain and the steady sound of it dripping from the trees. By morning, the rain had turned to mist. The air was cold enough that my breath looked like smoke when I stepped out of the truck. The ground was covered in water and half-frozen mud. Bailey sniffed around cautiously, her tail low. When I walked over to the edge of the clearing where I'd seen the man, I saw the prints. Deep, uneven footprints leading from the trees to where he'd stood, then turning back again. They were long and wide, the left one dragging a streak behind it like he'd been pulling his foot. But the trail didn't go far. It stopped halfway into the woods, right where the ground turned soft and marshy. There were no other footprints beyond that, just empty waterlogged leaves. I waited until mid-morning before deciding to pack up. I didn't want to, but something in my gut told me to leave. Maybe it was the unease, maybe it was common sense. I loaded the tools back into the truck, checked the perimeter one more time, and left the site behind. When I reached the main road an hour later, I passed an old service truck pulled over near the creek. A county worker was standing beside it, writing something on a clipboard. I slowed down to ask if everything was all right, and he told me they'd found a wrecked car downstream that morning. Said it had gone off the dirt road sometime the night before. A man in his 40s had been driving alone. He didn't survive the crash. The name didn't mean anything to me, but I remember the worker saying the car must have rolled at least 100 feet down the slope before hitting the water. They found the man outside the vehicle like he tried to crawl out before he died. I didn't tell him what I saw. I just nodded and drove away. That night, when I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the clearing. The limp, the dragging, the silence. I went back to that land 2 weeks later when the weather cleared up, but I never found any more footprints. The ground had dried, and whatever signs there'd been were gone. I finished building the cabin eventually. Took me all summer, but even now, every time it rains, I still remember that night. The dragging sound through the mud, the slow movement of a figure in the dark, and the way he turned his head toward me just before vanishing. Sometimes, when it rains and I sit inside that cabin, I still look toward that same patch of trees. I know what I saw wasn't a ghost or some fairy tale story. It was real. He was real. And maybe on that night, he just hadn't realized he was already gone. It was late October of 2013 when I drove out to the northern edge of Montana, somewhere near the foothills of the Rockies. I had taken a week off from my job at a construction company in Spokane, hoping to get away from everything for a bit. No calls, no noise, just quiet. A friend had mentioned an old hunting cabin his uncle used to own, left abandoned for years, but supposedly still standing. He said it was tucked back off an unmarked trail near a dry creek bed. I didn't have any other plans, so I figured a few nights there would do me good. I reached the area by late afternoon. The last stretch of road was barely a road at all, just a pair of tire ruts cutting through the grass. The air smelled like pine and cold dirt. The mountains were gray in the distance, their tops covered with early snow. I parked my truck on a patch of flat ground near a line of trees and started walking with my backpack and a small cooler. It took me about 20 minutes to find the cabin. It stood half hidden behind some thick brush, about 50 yards from the creek. The place looked like it hadn't seen a human in decades. The wood was dark and rotted in spots, and the roof sagged near the middle. One window was cracked open, another boarded up. The door hung crooked but still closed tight. I pushed it open, and the smell hit me right away. Dust, old wood, and that faint smell of mold that comes from damp places sealed too long. Inside, it was one room with a short hallway leading to what looked like a back storage area. The main space had an old iron stove, a wooden table, and 2 chairs, one of them missing a leg. There were shelves with jars still sitting on them, empty, dusty glass jars with rusted lids. A dead mouse lay in one corner. The floor creaked every time I shifted my weight. But it was quiet. That's what I'd come for. I spent the first hour cleaning up, just enough to make it livable. I swept out the dust with a branch, cleared a corner for my sleeping bag, and checked the stove to see if it worked. Surprisingly, it did. I gathered some wood from outside and got a small fire going. The cabin warmed up quickly, and the smell of smoke mixed with that old wood scent. For a while, it almost felt peaceful. By nightfall, the forest outside had gone completely still. I didn't hear any birds or crickets, just the sound of the fire popping now and then. The quiet was heavy. I sat by the stove, ate a sandwich, and wrote a few things in a small notebook I kept. Around 9, I decided to step outside to stretch my legs. The night was darker than I expected. No moon, just the faint outline of trees against the sky. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, landing on tall grass and low bushes. I could hear the faint trickle of the creek somewhere nearby. Then I noticed something strange. A single wooden post about 50 feet from the cabin. It looked like part of an old fence, but it was the only one standing. When I got closer, I saw what looked like scratch marks on it. Long, uneven, deep grooves. Not claw marks exactly, too wide and too uneven. I ran my fingers over them and felt splinters and small bits of old, dry wood flake away. It made me uneasy, so I headed back inside and locked the door with the rusted latch. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every sound seemed too loud. I heard something outside around 2 in the morning, slow, deliberate footsteps. Not heavy, but clear. They circled around the cabin, stopping near the window at one point. I held my breath, listening. The fire had burned low, and the room was dim with only the faint orange glow left inside. I didn't move. After a minute or 2, the sound faded away into the woods. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, but the way it moved didn't sound right. It was too steady, too human. By morning, I almost laughed at myself. The forest plays tricks on your ears when you're alone. I made coffee on the stove, ate a granola bar, and decided to walk along the creek to clear my head. The air was sharp and cold, my breath showing in front of me. The creek was barely flowing, more like a series of shallow puddles connected by mud. A few old beer cans and bits of broken glass lay near the water, signs that someone had been out here years ago. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something that stopped me cold. My backpack, which I had left zipped up and leaning against the wall, was open. Some of my food packets were missing, and one of my shirts was gone. The door was still latched from the inside. There were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. I checked the corners of the cabin, even the small back storage area, but it was empty. The back door, which I hadn't noticed before, was nailed shut from the inside. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. Maybe I had left it open and animals got in, but that didn't explain the missing shirt. I didn't want to think about what else it could be. I decided to stay one more night, but I was on edge the entire day. Every little sound outside made me look up. I started keeping the hatchet from my truck next to my sleeping bag. I even moved one of the broken chairs against the door so it would make noise if it opened. When darkness came again, the silence returned. I sat near the stove, listening to the creaks of the cabin settling. Around midnight, I heard something again, this time softer, like fabric brushing against wood. Then a light tapping sound, not loud but steady. I turned off my flashlight and sat in the dark, my heart pounding. The sound came from the wall behind the stove.
Top, top, top.
Then silence. After what felt like an hour, I finally got up and checked the wall. I pressed my ear against the wood. Nothing. I stayed up the rest of the night, waiting for the light to come. When morning came, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up quickly, checked outside one last time, and froze. Near the same post I had seen the night before, there was something new. My missing shirt hanging neatly on the top of it. It was dry and clean. No dirt, no tears, just hanging there like someone had placed it carefully. The air felt heavy again, cold against my skin even though the sun was up. I didn't bother to look around. I grabbed my bag, threw it in the truck, and left. I didn't even take the main road back. I just followed the dirt path until I hit pavement again. I didn't stop until I was well out of those woods. Later that night, when I was home, I kept thinking about that cabin. I kept going over everything in my head, trying to explain it. Maybe someone was living out there, some drifter or squatter who didn't want to be found. Maybe they'd been watching me the whole time, waiting until I slept. The scratches on the post, the footsteps, the missing food, all of it fit. What still bothers me, though, is that shirt. Whoever it was didn't steal it or tear it up. They cleaned it and hung it back up, right where I would see it before leaving. Almost like they wanted me to know they'd been there the whole time. I haven't gone back to Montana since then. I told my friend the cabin wasn't there anymore, just to make sure he wouldn't send anyone else. I still think about that place sometimes, though. How quiet it was, how still the air felt, and how something out there in those woods knew I was alone. And if I ever catch that same scent of old, damp wood again, it takes me right back to that night, sitting in that cabin, listening to something breathing just on the other side of the wall. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to spend a few days alone in a small cabin I had rented near a quiet stretch of woods in northern Maine. I was 27 then, working long hours at a warehouse in Bangor, and I just wanted silence. No phones, no people, no sound of traffic. The cabin I found online looked perfect. It was about 2 miles off a gravel road, surrounded by thick pines and a narrow creek that ran behind it. The pictures showed a small porch, a metal roof, and a single room inside with a wood stove, a small bed, and a kitchenette. I figured I'd take a few books, some food, and just be alone for a while. The drive there took nearly 4 hours. Once I turned off the main highway, the road turned into rough gravel that kept winding through the trees. My phone lost signal about 20 minutes before I reached the cabin. When I finally saw it, it looked older than in the pictures. Some of the paint was peeling off the porch railings, and one of the steps had a crack across it. Still, it felt peaceful. The air was colder up there, with that damp forest smell that sinks into your clothes. I unpacked my things, filled a jug from the creek to boil for water, and settled in. The cabin had one big window facing the trees, and I remember standing there for a long time just staring out at the woods. Everything was still, not even a bird sound. It was quiet in a way that felt heavy, but I liked it. That night, I lit a small fire in the stove and read until I fell asleep. The second night was when I started feeling uneasy. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the side of the cabin. It wasn't loud, just a slow scraping noise, like someone dragging a branch along the wood. I sat up in bed and listened. It stopped for a few seconds, then started again, this time closer to the window. The fire in the stove had gone down to faint orange light, and the shadows moved across the ceiling whenever it flickered. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or maybe wind moving a branch, but the sound kept going in this slow, deliberate pattern. After a few minutes, it stopped completely. I waited for a while before lying back down, but my heart wouldn't slow down. When I went outside the next morning, I looked around the cabin and found marks on the lower part of the wall, thin scratches that looked fresh. I bent down and ran my hand over them. The wood felt rough and splintered. The ground around the cabin was soft from the previous day's rain, and I saw what looked like footprints near the back corner, though they were hard to make out. I told myself they were probably my own from when I unloaded the car, but I didn't remember walking that far around. I brushed it off, made breakfast, and tried to forget about it. That afternoon, the wind picked up and the trees started swaying, creaking against each other. I spent most of the day inside reading, trying not to think about the noises outside. When it got dark, I boiled some soup on the stove and watched the fire through the small glass door. For a while, everything felt fine again. I even started to think I had overreacted about the scratches. Then sometime around 11, I heard something outside again. Not scraping this time, footsteps. Slow, heavy ones crunching on the damp leaves. They stopped, then moved again, circling around. The air in the cabin felt tight. I turned down the stove light and stood near the window, staring out into the dark. My reflection covered most of the glass, but when my eyes adjusted, I could see faint movement between the trees. A figure, dark, still, standing near the edge of the clearing. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person. They weren't moving, just facing the cabin. I stood there frozen for a long time. My hands felt numb, my ears were ringing. Then I blinked, and the figure was gone. I didn't hear footsteps leaving, just silence again. I stayed awake all night, sitting by the stove with a knife from the kitchen next to me. Every few minutes I thought I heard something. A creak, a soft thud, but I couldn't tell if it was real or just my mind playing tricks. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud near the front porch. They were clearly from boots, not animals. They led from the tree line to the steps, then stopped. I looked around and didn't see any tire tracks or sign of a car. The nearest town was almost 10 miles away. I tried to convince myself maybe it was a hunter passing through. But why would anyone walk straight up to my cabin at night and just stand there? I thought about leaving that day, but I had already paid for the full week, and part of me didn't want to look paranoid. So I stayed another night. I shouldn't have. By evening, the wind had died completely. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. I felt watched the entire time, like eyes were on me even when I was inside. When it got dark, I locked the door and pushed the small table against it just to feel a little safer. I left the fire burning low so I could see around the room. Around midnight, I heard the back window rattle, just once. Then again, a little harder. My stomach dropped. I picked up the knife again and stood as still as I could. The window shook once more, and I saw the outline of a hand press against the glass. The fingers were long, dirty, smudging the pane. I could see the shape clearly because of the dim firelight reflecting off it. It stayed there for several seconds, then slid down slowly, leaving a streak. I didn't move. I waited, listening to my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then there was the sound of boots moving around the side of the cabin. I heard them pause near the door, then nothing. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I moved to the corner of the room where the shadows were thickest and waited until morning light started to come through the curtains. When I stepped outside, the air felt sharp and cold. The footprints were there again, circling the cabin. Whoever it was had come right up to the windows and moved around several times. I followed them to the edge of the woods, but they just disappeared into the thick brush. That's when I packed everything I could fit into the car and left. I didn't even bother locking up. When I reached the main road, I stopped at a small gas station about 30 minutes away. I told the guy working there that I had rented one of the cabins up by the old logging trail. His face changed immediately. He said that place hadn't been officially rented out in years. The owner had stopped maintaining it after a break-in a long time ago. I didn't ask for details. I just nodded, paid for gas, and drove straight back to Bangor. For days afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. Every small sound made me jump. I kept thinking about that hand on the glass, how deliberate it looked, how calm the person seemed standing there. A few weeks later, I looked up the cabin listing again. It was gone. The website that had hosted it had removed all the information. I never went back to any cabin after that. Even now, years later, whenever I'm out in the countryside and see a small house surrounded by trees, something in my chest tightens, because I know that whoever was out there that night wasn't trying to break in. They were just standing there watching me, and somehow that made it much worse. It was the fall of 2017 when I decided to rent a small cabin for a week near the Arizona-New Mexico border. I was 29 at the time, worn out from city life and desperate for some quiet. The cabin was old but cheap, tucked deep inside a patch of pine woods about 2 hours from Gallup. It sat near a dry riverbed, surrounded by uneven hills and brush that stretched for miles. The road to get there was little more than a dirt track, with no cell signal past the main highway. I wanted peace, and that's exactly what it gave me, at least for the first 2 days. The cabin itself was a squat wooden structure, built decades ago, judging by the cracked beams and warped flooring. The air inside smelled like old wood and dust, mixed with a faint chemical scent from the varnish someone had used on the counters years ago. There was one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a back porch that overlooked the woods. A single generator powered the place, and the owner had warned me it ran loud when it kicked on at night. I didn't mind. I was used to city noise, sirens, engines, shouting, but this was a different kind of sound. When the generator stopped, the silence was total. The first few nights passed quietly. I spent my days hiking, taking photographs of the desert trees, the red dirt trails, the deer tracks that crossed the hills. At night, I would sit on the porch with a beer, listening to the dry wind move through the branches. The air was cold after sunset, and I liked the stillness of it. I remember thinking it was almost too quiet. No crickets, no frogs, just wind and the low hum of the generator behind the cabin. On the third night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of the generator shutting off. I figured it had run out of fuel, so I decided to check it. I grabbed my flashlight and pulled on my jacket. When I opened the door, the cold hit me immediately, sharp and dry, carrying a smell like dirt after lightning. The beam of my flashlight swung across the yard, cutting through the mist that had gathered low to the ground. I stepped off the porch and heard something, just a short, dragging sound, coming from behind the cabin, near the shed where the generator was kept. At first, I thought it was an animal. Coyotes weren't uncommon around here, and I'd seen a few earlier that day wandering near the road. I walked closer, shining the light on the shed. The generator sat beside it, silent. The metal casing was streaked with dirt, and there were fresh marks near the base, like something had been clawing or scraping it. I crouched down, and that's when I noticed the footprints. They were barefoot prints, human-shaped but longer, wider, and spaced unevenly, as if whoever made them had run on all fours part of the way. The prints went from the side of the shed toward the tree line. My first thought was that some drunk had wandered up here, maybe someone from a nearby house I hadn't seen, but there were no other houses within miles. I followed the prints a few feet before stopping. The woods ahead were black, the flashlight barely cutting into them. The ground was covered in dry needles and brush, and I could hear something moving deeper in there. A faint shuffle, slow, like someone crawling or dragging something heavy. The sound made my chest tighten. I turned and went back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. For the rest of the night, I sat awake, listening. Every now and then, there'd be a sound outside. The crunch of leaves, the faint patter of something circling the cabin. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I checked the area again. The footprints were still there, though some had been blurred by wind. I followed them only a few yards into the trees before they vanished in the loose dirt. Nothing else seemed disturbed. The generator still wouldn't start, so I spent most of that day fixing it, trying not to think about what I'd seen. By the fifth night, I was starting to feel uneasy. I'd begun to notice small things: scratches on the back door, strange noises just after dark, and once, a low sound that almost resembled breathing near my window. The woods, which had seemed so peaceful before, now looked darker, more crowded. That evening, I decided to pack up early and leave in the morning. I cooked a quick dinner, cleaned up, and sat by the window with my flashlight beside me. The air outside was still, no wind at all. Around 11 p.m., I heard it again, the slow dragging sound. This time, it was closer. I stood up and turned off the lantern, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness inside. Through the window, the yard looked pale under the moonlight. Something was moving just past the edge of the trees. It wasn't walking upright. It was hunched, crawling on all fours, its limbs long and thin. The light caught its back for a second, and I saw the shape of what looked like human skin stretched too tightly over bone. I froze. It stopped moving and turned its head toward the cabin. I couldn't see its face clearly, just a blur of pale skin and something dark where its eyes should have been. It started moving again, slower this time, creeping along the ground toward the porch. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone, but there was still no signal. The thing stopped near the steps and rose slightly, its head tilting in a strange, twitching motion, like it was trying to listen. I stood perfectly still, afraid to breathe. It stayed there for almost a full minute, then lowered itself again and crawled back toward the woods. I didn't sleep that night either. When the sun came up, I grabbed my things, loaded my car, and drove out of there without looking back. The road out felt longer than it had when I arrived, and every shadow between the trees made me flinch. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, where the first signal bars appeared on my phone. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel outside Gallup. I told myself it had just been an animal, maybe a starving coyote with mange or a person high on something. But when I took another look at the photos on my phone, the ones I'd taken during my hikes, I noticed something strange in one of them. In a shot of the dry riverbed, taken the day before the generator had gone out, there was a faint figure standing far in the background among the trees. It wasn't clear, but the shape was familiar. Long arms, narrow body, pale skin. I deleted the photo right after that. I don't know why, maybe because part of me didn't want proof. I've told myself it was just a trick of light, just the mind making shapes where there were none. But every time I close my eyes and think about that cabin, I still remember that dragging sound outside the walls and those prints in the dirt that didn't belong to anything I could explain. I never went back to that part of Arizona again. A few months later, when I looked up the property online, the listing was gone. The owner had sold it or maybe just stopped renting it out. But sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that place. The smell of the wood, the silence after the generator died, the thing that crouched just beyond the porch light, and I wonder if someone else ever stayed there after me. And if they did, whether they heard that same dragging sound in the dirt when the power went out. It had been almost 4 years since my ex-husband, Mark, died. I hadn't been back to the cabin since the week before the accident. The same cabin he insisted on building by himself in the thick of the Appalachian woods, about 10 miles outside a small town called Halewood, North Carolina. It wasn't much, really. 2 small rooms, rough timber walls, a tin roof that clanged whenever the wind pushed through the trees. But back when we were married, that place meant something. It was supposed to be our quiet retreat from everything. The noise, the people, the constant fights that we didn't want anyone else to see. After the divorce, I promised myself I'd never go back there. But after he passed away, the cabin somehow became mine again. part of the property settlement, part of the unspoken guilt I carried. I ignored it for as long as I could, but last October I finally gave in. I told myself I just wanted to clean it out, maybe sell it. But deep down, I think I wanted to see if there was anything left of him there. Something I hadn't said. Something that could make sense of it all. I drove out early in the morning, leaving before sunrise. The road to Halewood was just as narrow and cracked as I remembered, with branches arching over the edges like old hands reaching across the road. My car struggled up the last few miles of dirt path, the tires spitting out small stones. The air grew colder the higher I went, the kind of cold that sits deep in your skin even though it's only autumn. When I reached the clearing, the cabin looked smaller than I remembered, more like a dark stain in the middle of the overgrown brush. The wood had gone gray and dry, the front steps sagging slightly to one side. The front door was still the same, though with the dent near the handle from when Mark once slammed it too hard trying to keep it shut during a storm. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it, before I finally pushed it open. Inside, it smelled exactly the same. A mix of pine, dust, and old smoke. The air was heavy and still, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The windows were streaked with dirt, letting in only a dull orange light through the trees. I could see the outlines of things that hadn't been moved since he was alive. The old rocking chair near the window, the shelf of half-empty bottles, the wood stove that always burned too hot. I tried not to look at everything too closely, but my eyes couldn't help it. Every corner was like a photograph from another time. The first hour I spent just walking around in silence, sweeping dust, folding the few old blankets that were still there. My hands shook a little every time I picked something up that used to belong to him. A knife, a cap, an old notebook. I found his work boots by the door, still caked with dried mud. I didn't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to move them. They looked like they were waiting for him. I stepped outside for a bit, trying to shake the strange tightness that was growing in my chest. The woods around the cabin were completely still. No birds, no movement. Not even the sound of the creek nearby that used to trickle loud enough to hear from the porch. It was unsettling. I walked around the side of the cabin and noticed fresh footprints in the dirt. Large ones, heavy, pressed deep into the soft ground. They weren't mine. They led from the trees to the back door and then disappeared into the brush again. At first I thought maybe they were from a hunter or a park worker, but there hadn't been any sign of people nearby. The path to the cabin was nearly impossible for anyone to stumble upon by accident. Still, I tried to ignore it, told myself the rain last week could have made old prints look new. I went back inside, locked the door out of habit, and kept cleaning. By late afternoon, the light had started to fade faster than I expected. The sky outside turned grayish blue, and the air inside the cabin felt colder, heavier. I decided to stay the night. I hadn't planned to, but the drive back through the woods in the dark wasn't something I wanted to do alone. I found the old kerosene lamp on the shelf and filled it, lit it, and watched its glow flicker over the wooden walls. I tried to eat something, just a small can of beans I brought, but I couldn't get past the knot in my stomach. I kept thinking about those footprints, about how fresh they looked, about how quiet it was outside. There was something wrong about the stillness. Even when I turned off the lamp to rest, the silence pressed against my ears until it felt unbearable. I lay down on the small cot in the corner and stared up at the ceiling beams. I must have dozed off, but I woke up suddenly when I heard something outside. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. Not fast, not random, just one step at a time. Then a pause. Then another step came from behind the cabin, near the trees. My whole body froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The sound stopped for a long minute, and then there was a faint creak. The back porch. I sat up, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it echo in my ears. I didn't have a weapon, not even a stick. I remembered there was a hammer in the toolbox by the stove, but I was too scared to move. The boards in the back groaned softly, then stopped. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't walking around. They were standing still, listening. I waited for what felt like hours, but the sounds didn't come again. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless half-sleep. When I woke again, the sky outside was pale gray. Morning. I got up quickly and went to the back door. The dirt outside was marked. Clear footprints again, this time right up against the steps. They were still damp from the morning dew. Someone had been there close enough to touch the handle. I packed up everything I could, stuffing the few belongings I wanted to keep into a bag. I didn't even bother locking the place up. As I turned to leave, I noticed something strange near the window. A small smudge of dirt on the glass, shaped like the edge of a handprint. It was on the inside. The drive back felt endless. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone walking behind the car, someone I didn't recognize. My phone didn't get a signal until I hit the main road, and even then, I didn't call anyone. I didn't know what I would say. That someone had been watching the cabin? That maybe I shouldn't have gone back? When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something with me. Not a person, not something supernatural, just a weight, like something unseen had attached itself to the memory of that place. I washed every piece of clothing I wore, threw away my shoes, but the smell of the cabin, that mix of pine, smoke, and damp wood, stayed on me for days. A week later, the sheriff from Halewood called. He said someone had broken into a few cabins in that area, probably living rough in the woods. They found evidence of an old campsite not far from mine. Torn blankets, empty cans, a fire pit. When he asked if I'd seen anything, I said no. I didn't tell him about the footprints or the handprint, or the night I spent listening to someone move just outside the wall. I sold the cabin a month later. Didn't even go back for the final inspection. I signed the papers and handed over the keys without a second thought. But every now and then, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear the sound of slow, careful footsteps. Not in the woods, but somewhere close, moving just outside the walls of my house. I tell myself it's just my mind replaying things, trying to fill in the quiet. But sometimes, when the air feels still and heavy, I can almost smell it again. That same faint mix of pine, dust, and smoke, as if that cabin never really let me leave. It was late October of 2017, and I remember the weather turning colder much faster than usual that year. I had taken a week off from work to spend some quiet time in a small cabin I owned near the edge of a thick pine forest in northern Montana. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a single bedroom, a small kitchen, a wood stove, and an old porch that creaked whenever I stepped on it. I had been there many times before, but this trip felt different for some reason. Maybe it was the silence that hung heavier than usual, or maybe it was just the sharp wind that seemed to never stop blowing. My dog, a large brown Labrador named Duke, was with me as always. He was getting older but still alert, the kind of dog that didn't bark unless he had a real reason. The cabin sat about 6 miles off the main road, down a dirt trail that most people wouldn't even notice if they drove past. The nearest town, Black Ridge, was about 25 miles away. Once you were out there, you were alone. No cell service, no electricity except from the generator, and no neighbors for miles. That was the way I liked it. The stillness of that place always gave me time to think. The first few days were uneventful. I split some firewood, fixed the gutter on the side of the cabin, and went fishing in the nearby stream. Duke followed me everywhere, always close, never straying too far. The days were calm, and the nights were quiet except for the wind pushing through the trees and the occasional sound of something small moving through the brush. But on the fourth night, the quiet started to feel different. It began raining just after sunset. The rain wasn't heavy at first, just a slow, steady drizzle, but it didn't stop. The sound of it tapping on the tin roof was constant. I had the wood stove going, and the smell of burning pine filled the small cabin. Duke was lying near the fire, breathing softly. I remember sitting at the small table, writing in an old notebook, when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, something between a thud and a scrape. I paused, listening, thinking maybe it was a branch falling. But then it came again, closer this time. Duke lifted his head, ears perked, eyes fixed on the window. I waited, not moving, not breathing. The sound came once more, a slow, dragging noise that seemed to circle around the cabin. I stood up quietly and turned off the lantern, leaving only the dim light from the stove. The rain was louder now, and the wind had picked up, but I could still hear something moving just beyond the wall. Duke growled low, deep in his chest. His eyes followed the sound as it passed by the front door, then along the side wall, and finally faded toward the back of the cabin. I waited for several minutes before I stepped to the window. The forest was pitch black, the rain cutting through the air like silver threads whenever the lightning flashed. I saw nothing but the edge of the tree line and the shadow of my truck parked out front. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe, or even a bear, but something about the way the sound moved didn't fit. It had been too slow, too deliberate. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the siding, made me tighten my grip on the flashlight. Duke stayed close to the door the whole time, staring out as if he expected something to return. By morning, the rain had turned the ground into thick mud. I walked around the cabin to check for tracks, half expecting to see nothing at all. But near the back wall, under the kitchen window, there were prints, deep, uneven ones. They weren't boot prints, and they weren't from an animal either. They looked like bare feet, but larger than normal, wider too, and pressed deep enough into the mud to show someone had stood there for a while. The shape was distorted by the rain, but I could tell they weren't mine. A strange unease followed me the rest of that day. I went about the usual chores, chopping more wood, checking the generator, but my mind kept going back to those prints. The idea that someone could have been standing out there in the dark, circling the cabin while I was inside, made my skin crawl. That night, the rain came back harder. The wind howled through the trees, and the temperature dropped low enough for me to see my breath near the window. I made sure the door was locked, something I usually didn't bother with out there. Duke wouldn't leave my side. He followed me from room to room, ears twitching, eyes sharp. Sometime past midnight, I woke up to him growling again. It wasn't loud, but it was steady and deep, a warning. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. Over the noise of the storm, I heard something out by the porch. A single creak, then another. I reached for the flashlight and pointed it toward the door, though I didn't turn it on. Duke moved closer, his fur bristled. There was a long moment where nothing happened. Then came a soft sound, like fingertips brushing against the window frame. Slow, dragging movements, pausing every few seconds. I couldn't see a thing, but I knew someone was out there. I could feel it, that strange heaviness in the air, the same one I'd felt the night before. I waited, frozen, listening. The sound moved again, this time along the side of the cabin, then toward the back. I stood up and followed it, keeping my steps quiet. Duke was right next to me. When I reached the back window, I caught the faintest shape in the darkness. A figure standing just beyond the glass, not moving. It was too dark to make out any features, but I could tell it was tall, maybe 6 feet or more. It stood there for several seconds before stepping back and disappearing into the rain. I didn't go outside. I just stayed inside with the lights off until morning. When the sun finally came up, I walked the perimeter again. The mud was worse than before, and the tracks were everywhere now, circling the cabin, leading up to the porch, and stopping right beneath the window where I had seen the shape. Whoever it was had been out there for hours, maybe watching me the whole time. That was the moment I decided to leave. I packed everything quickly, barely eating breakfast. I loaded my gear into the truck and called Duke to jump in. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone emerge from the trees. But the forest was quiet again, almost too quiet. As I drove down the muddy trail, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the cabin getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind the pines. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road, tires slipping in the wet dirt. I didn't feel safe until I saw the lights of Black Ridge far in the distance. When I finally got home later that evening, I sat down and thought about what happened. The prints, the sounds, the figure. I went over every detail, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was some drifter passing through, maybe someone lost in the woods, or maybe just some stranger who stumbled across the cabin. But whoever it was, they weren't just wandering. They had been watching. I never went back to that cabin after that trip. I ended up selling it the following spring. The new owner told me later that he found strange footprints around the property during the first rain of the season. He laughed about it, said maybe it was a bear walking oddly. But I knew better. Even now, years later, when it rains at night and the wind picks up against the house, I still find myself listening for that slow, dragging sound outside the window, the one that started everything. Duke passed away a year after that trip, and sometimes when it rains, I still imagine him sitting by the door, ears perked, guarding me from something out there in the dark that I never quite understood but never forgot. It was late autumn in 2016 when I decided to take a short break from everything and head to a cabin I had rented online. It was somewhere deep in the northern part of Idaho, surrounded by dense pine forest and old dirt roads that twisted for miles before reaching any sign of civilization. I was 32 at the time, working as a mechanic in Spokane, and I had just needed space, quiet space, away from the sound of traffic and the faces I saw every day. The cabin was old but sturdy, sitting near the base of a hill that sloped down toward a shallow creek. I had brought my dog, Ranger, a brown mixed breed with sharp eyes and a habit of pacing when something bothered him. The drive there was long, nearly 6 hours through rough, uneven roads. By the time I arrived, the sky was already dimming, the last streaks of sunlight fading through thick gray clouds. I remember the way the air smelled: wet pine, cold dirt, and something faintly metallic. The cabin was small, built from dark wood that had started to gray with age, and the windows were clouded from the inside, like no one had cleaned them in years. There was a porch that creaked under my boots and a single metal chair left there, rusted from years of rain. I unloaded my bags, set Ranger's bed in a corner, and got the small wood stove going. That first night was calm. The rain started sometime around midnight, slow and steady, tapping softly on the roof. Ranger curled up beside the bed, and I fell asleep to the faint hum of wind moving through the trees. The next morning, I explored the area a little. There was a narrow dirt trail behind the cabin that led into the woods. It looked like no one had walked there in years, but I followed it anyway, Ranger trotting ahead with his tail low. After about 20 minutes, the path opened into a small clearing. There were broken branches everywhere, and in the middle of the clearing stood an old shed, half collapsed. Its door was missing, and the inside was dark, cluttered with what looked like rusted tools and broken shelves. I didn't go in. The place felt wrong, not haunted, just used. Used in a way that made me uneasy, like someone had been there recently but hadn't cared to clean up. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something small but odd. The front door was slightly open. I was sure I had latched it before leaving. Ranger noticed too. His ears perked, and he stood at the doorway, sniffing the air. I went inside and checked around. Nothing was missing, nothing out of place. I convinced myself it was the wind. The latch was old, maybe it had just loosened. Still, I dragged a small table in front of the door that night just in case. By the third day, the weather had turned bad. Heavy rain poured without pause, and the wind made the trees creak like they were ready to snap. I stayed indoors most of the day, reading a book I'd brought, cooking some canned food, and letting Ranger nap near the fire. It was peaceful enough until around dusk, when Ranger suddenly got up, walked to the door, and started growling low. I muted the small radio I had on and listened. The sound came faintly through the rain, something like slow, crunching footsteps on the wet ground outside. Then silence. I waited, trying to listen harder, but all I could hear was the rain hitting the roof. Ranger stayed alert for a long time, standing near the window, ears twitching. I told myself it could have been an animal, a deer, maybe an elk wandering close. But even after an hour, he wouldn't settle down. He kept pacing from the door to the window, back and forth, until finally I gave up and took the flashlight, stepped out onto the porch and looked around. The beam of light cut through the rain but showed nothing. Just the yard, the trees, and the thin mist hanging low over the grass. I went back inside, locked the door again, and tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I barely slept. The sound of the rain and wind kept me half awake, and every time I closed my eyes, I felt that same uneasy pressure, the feeling that someone was out there, standing just beyond the window. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud outside. Not mine, not from the dog either. They were boot prints, deep, spaced apart, leading from the side of the woods straight toward the cabin and stopping just under the front window. I crouched and looked at them for a long time. They were fresh. You could see where the water had filled in the edges but hadn't completely washed them away yet. Ranger wouldn't go near that part of the yard. He stayed by the steps, watching the tree line, tail stiff. The cabin suddenly didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt too open, too exposed. I checked all the windows, made sure they were locked tight, and pushed furniture in front of the back door. The rest of the day, I stayed inside, listening, waiting. That night, it happened again. Around 1 a.m., Ranger started growling low and constant. His fur stood up along his back, and he faced the window again, the same one near the footprints. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. This time, I heard it clearly, soft, slow movement outside, the crunch of wet ground, the faint thud of steps. I didn't move. Ranger barked once, loud, and the sound outside stopped. Complete silence. After a minute, I heard the faint sound of something brushing the wall, like a hand dragging along the wood. Then a pause. Then more slow footsteps moving away toward the trees. I stayed still for a long time before I finally dared to move again. When daylight came, the ground outside was a mess of tracks. More boot prints, circling the cabin this time. Whoever it was had walked around more than once during the night. I followed them for about 50 feet into the trees, then stopped. They led deeper into the woods in the same direction as that old shed. I didn't follow further. I turned back. By then, the rain had slowed, and I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed up fast, barely eating anything. I loaded the truck, called Ranger into the passenger seat, and started driving. The road was slick and narrow, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get back to the main highway to see other people again. But just as I passed the clearing where the shed was, I slowed down. Something caught my eye. The shed's door, the one that had been missing before, was back on. Not new, just a broken wooden plank leaned upright like someone had tried to close it again. There were fresh tire marks in the mud nearby. Not mine. I didn't stop. I pressed the gas harder and drove until the trees thinned out and the first cell signal bars reappeared on my phone. When I got home that evening, I checked the news out of habit. I didn't expect anything, but there it was, a small article about an arrest near the northern Idaho woods. A man had been caught hiding in a hunting cabin, armed and wanted in several states for assault and robbery. The police had found makeshift bedding, empty food cans, and a small pile of stolen things, including a few personal items that looked like they'd come from different cabins and campsites in that same region. I never went back to that place again. I don't even know if I could find the road now, but I still think about those footprints, about how close they were to the window, and about how if Ranger hadn't woken me that night, maybe I wouldn't have known someone was there at all. It wasn't the forest that scared me. It wasn't the rain or the dark. It was realizing how quiet a person can move when they're patient enough, how long someone can stand just outside a wall, listening, waiting. Sometimes when I walk Ranger at night now, even in my own neighborhood, I still catch myself glancing at windows, checking reflections, half expecting to see a shadow standing there in the rain, just watching. It was early October of 1996 when I drove out to the old logging roads outside of Ten Sleep, Wyoming. I had taken a week off from my job in Cheyenne to clear my head, get away from people, and finish fixing up a small hunting cabin my uncle had left behind after he passed. It sat deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest paved road, with a dirt trail that looked like it hadn't seen a proper vehicle in years. The place was falling apart when I first saw it. The roof sagged near the back, one of the porch steps had split in half, and a faint smell of old smoke and damp would lingered in every corner. But it was peaceful, quiet in a way you can't find anywhere near town. I brought my dog, Ranger, a thick-coated, calm old shepherd who never barked unless something was really wrong. I packed light, some canned food, a few tools, my rifle, a folding cot, and enough supplies to last the week. The weather was colder than expected that year, and the wind carried a bite even during the day. By the time I reached the cabin, the light was slipping away behind the hills. The trees cast long shadows across the clearing, and the forest floor was soft with pine needles and damp soil. I parked the truck off to the side, grabbed my gear, and walked up the few uneven steps. The door creaked open, and dust rose off the floorboards when I stepped inside. The smell was heavier than I remembered. Wet wood, rusted metal, and the faint, stale scent of animals that might have made it their home while it sat empty. I set up a small fire in the stove, unpacked my things, and cleaned up as best as I could. The place wasn't big. One main room, a small kitchen area with a rusted sink, and a side room where an old bed frame leaned against the wall. Outside, the air had turned colder, and the tree branches groaned under the weight of the wind. I sat by the stove with Ranger lying at my feet, his eyes half closed, the fire's glow flickering against the old wooden walls. That first night passed quietly, though I didn't sleep much. I could hear every sound, the wind pressing against the windows, branches scratching the roof, and once, what sounded like footsteps crunching outside. I told myself it was probably a deer or an elk moving through the trees, but I remember the way Ranger lifted his head and stared toward the door, ears raised, completely still. He didn't growl, just watched. I kept my hand near the rifle and stayed awake until the fire burned low and the noise faded. The next morning, I stepped outside to check around. The air was misty, cold enough that my breath hung in front of me. There were prints near the side of the cabin in the soft ground by the wall. Not animal prints. Boots. Old maybe. Hard to tell. I convinced myself they were mine from the day before, though they seemed too close to the cabin for that to make sense. I spent most of the day repairing the roof, hammering in loose boards and sealing gaps with what little material I had. Around mid-afternoon, the quiet started to bother me. The woods were silent. Not a single bird or insect. Even the wind had gone still. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears until you start to hear your own heartbeat. Ranger stayed close to the porch, his eyes following something in the tree line I couldn't see. Later that evening, I walked down toward the small creek about 100 yards from the cabin to wash up. The ground was slick, the light fading fast. When I knelt to splash water on my face, I caught sight of something across the creek. A piece of blue fabric hanging from a low branch, torn, like part of a jacket sleeve. I crossed over and picked it up. It was stiff, old, crusted with dirt and something darker that had dried years ago. There were no other signs of anything, no pack, no boots, no bones. Just that torn sleeve. When I got back, the fire was nearly out. I fed it more wood and tried not to think about the sleeve. The woods had a way of swallowing things, people, tools, old junk. Maybe someone had camped out there long ago. Still, the feeling that someone had been near didn't leave me. That night, it rained hard, steady and cold. I sat up in bed listening to it hammer the tin roof. Around midnight, I woke to Ranger pacing near the door, his nails clicking against the floorboards. He stood there, staring at the window. I pulled myself up, the air heavy with that smell of wet earth and smoke. I listened, nothing but the rain. Then, faintly, over the wind, I heard it, metal clanging softly, like something brushing against the truck outside. I moved slow, grabbed the rifle and pushed the door open. The cold hit me first, then the rain, and then the sight of the truck door half open. I was sure I had locked it. I stepped closer, scanning the trees with the flashlight. The beam caught nothing but the curtain of rain. The inside of the truck was wet, and one of the supply boxes I had in the back was gone. Just gone. I found the lid tossed into the mud a few feet away. It was one of the boxes that had tools in it, nails, rope, and a small axe. I looked around, the beam shaking slightly as I tried to follow any prints, but the rain had wiped everything clean. Back inside, I dried Ranger with an old towel and sat by the stove, rifle resting against my leg. I stayed like that for hours, listening to the rain and thinking about those boot prints. Sometime near dawn, I heard movement again, faint but real. It came from the back of the cabin, near the storage shed. I didn't go out this time. I just sat there and listened. The sound lasted maybe 5 minutes, like someone dragging something heavy. Then it stopped. By morning, the rain had cleared. I went out, careful, every step sinking into the wet soil. The storage shed door was open. Inside, the few things I had stored, firewood, an old gas can, a shovel, were all scattered. The axe that had been taken from the truck was leaning against the wall, clean, placed neatly like someone had set it back. That was the moment it stopped feeling like some stranger just passing through. Whoever it was had come back, maybe more than once, and wasn't afraid of being seen. I didn't stay another night. I packed everything as fast as I could, tossed what I didn't need into the truck, and loaded Ranger into the back seat. Before leaving, I stood there for a long moment looking at the cabin. The forest was still again, calm and harmless looking in the daylight. Halfway down the dirt road, I stopped near the bend where the trees thinned out. The mud on the trail showed tire tracks from my truck, and another set, older, narrow, leading in the opposite direction. They vanished halfway down the slope, like someone had stopped and turned around not long before I came. I didn't report it. There wasn't much to say. No proof of anything, no one around for miles. But a week after I got back home, I read a short article in a small local paper about a man who had gone missing up near the same stretch of forest back in the late 80s. They found his remains in a shallow pit near the creek a month later, after heavy rain uncovered part of his jacket. A torn blue sleeve. That cabin still stands, I'm sure. I never went back. Sometimes, when I think about that week, I remember the way the axe had been placed back against the shed wall, like whoever took it had wanted me to know they'd been there, and could come again anytime they wanted. I don't believe in ghosts or curses or anything like that, but I believe in people, the kind that vanish into the woods and learn to live without being found. The kind that watch from the dark while you sit by your fire, thinking you're alone.